The sun beat down on Dusty Ridge, a sprawling expanse of land that had been in Jedediah Jed Walker's family for 4 generations. His ranch, Walker's Way, was a testament to the grit and perseverance of his ancestors, a patchwork of rolling hills, grazing pastures, and a sturdy, weathered barn that had stood sentinel for over a century. Jed, a man whose hands were as rough as the bark of the ancient oak that stood near his porch, was a fixture in community, a quiet, dependable presence. His life, however, was about to be irrevocably altered by the encroachment of Harmony Meadows, a meticulously manicured, cookie-cutter housing development that had sprung up on the far edge of his property, where Old Man Hemmings's neglected cornfields used to be. The development, with its perfectly symmetrical lawns, pristine white fences, and the ubiquitous presence of the Harmony Meadows Homeowners Association, HOA, was a stark contrast to the rustic charm of Walker's Way. The HOA, led by the formidable and impeccably co of Karen Albright, was a force to be reckoned with. Karen, with her perfectly manicured nails and a voice that could cut through steel, was a firm believer in order, uniformity, and the stringent enforcement of the HOA's bylaws. She saw Jed's ranch as an eyesore, a chaotic relic of a bygone era that threatened the pristine image of Harmony Meadows. The first point of contention was the smell. Jed's cattle, a herd of sturdy Herefords, grazed on the pastures bordering the development, their presence a constant reminder of the rural life that Karen and her fellow residents had sought to escape. The aroma of manure, a natural byproduct of ranching, was deemed offensive and unacceptable by the HOA. Karen, armed with a clipboard and a meticulously typed list of complaints, approached Jed with a stern expression. "Mr. Walker," she began, her voice laced with thinly veiled disdain, "we've received numerous complaints about the odor emanating from your property. It's affecting the quality of life for our residents." Jed, who had been mending a fence, straightened up, his weathered face creased with a mixture of amusement and annoyance. "Ma'am, that's the smell of cows. It's natural. Been here longer than you have." "Natural or not, it's unacceptable," Karen retorted, her voice rising slightly. "We have bylaws that prohibit nuisances, and this stench is a clear violation." "Bylaws?" Jed chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Ma'am, I've been running this ranch for 50 years. Ain't never heard of no bylaws telling me how to run my cattle." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Karen threatening legal action and Jed refusing to budge. The HOA, emboldened by Karen's unwavering resolve, began a campaign of harassment. They sent Jed countless letters, each one filled with increasingly absurd demands. They complained about the dust kicked up by his tractor, the sound of his rooster crowing at dawn, and even the sight of his old pickup truck parked in his own driveway. Jed, a man of few words, tried to ignore the constant barrage of complaints. He focused on his work, tending to his cattle, repairing his fences, and maintaining the land that had been his family's legacy. But the HOA's relentless pressure began to take its toll. He was constantly on edge, dreading the next letter, the next complaint, the next confrontation. One afternoon, as Jed was rounding up his cattle for their evening feed, he noticed a police cruiser pulling up to his gate. Officer Miller, a young, earnest officer who had grown up in the area, stepped out of the car, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Walker," he began, "we've received a call from the Harmony Meadows HOA. They're complaining about your cattle." "What about 'em?" Jed asked, his voice tight. "They're saying they're trespassing on their property." Jed stared at the officer, his eyes narrowed. "Trespassing? My cattle ain't never left my land." "They're saying they're wandering through the fence," Officer Miller explained, his voice hesitant. "They're saying they're damaging their landscaping." Jed scoffed. The fence between his property and Harmony Meadows was a sturdy, well-maintained structure, built to withstand the force of his cattle. The idea that they could simply wander through it was ludicrous. "Officer," Jed said, his voice low and steady, "I've been running cattle here for 50 years. They ain't never trespassed on nobody's land. This is just them folks trying to cause trouble." Officer Miller, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, nodded. "I understand, Mr. Walker, but I have to investigate. I need to take a look at the fence." Jed reluctantly agreed, leading the officer to the fence line. As they walked, they could see Karen and a group of HOA members standing on the other side, their faces filled with self-righteous indignation. When they reached the fence, Officer Miller examined it carefully. He found no evidence of damage, no gaps, no signs of cattle having crossed it. He looked at Jed, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I don't see any evidence of trespassing. The fence is secure." Karen, however, was not deterred. She stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Officer, we have photographic evidence. We have pictures of those cows on our property." She pulled out her phone and showed Officer Miller a series of blurry photos, purportedly showing Jed's cattle grazing on the manicured lawns of Harmony Meadows. Officer Miller examined the photos, his brow furrowed. "Ma'am," he said, "these photos are blurry. It's hard to tell if they're even on your property. And even if they are, it doesn't prove they cross a fence." Karen, her face flushed with anger, was not ready to give up. "Officer," she said, her voice rising, "we are paying taxes. We have rights. We demand that you do something about this." Officer Miller, clearly overwhelmed by the situation, sighed. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but I can't take action without evidence. And right now, I don't have any." He turned to Jed, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Walker, I'm going to have to file a report, but I don't see any grounds for charges." Jed nodded, his expression grim. He knew this was just the beginning. The HOA wouldn't give up. They would continue to harass him, to try to force him off his land. And he was right. The HOA's campaign of harassment intensified. They filed a lawsuit against Jed, claiming that his ranch was a public nuisance, and seeking an injunction to force him to remove his cattle. They hired a high-powered law firm, known for its aggressive tactics and its willingness to exploit every legal loophole. Jed, a simple rancher, was out of his depth. He didn't have the resources to fight a legal battle against a wealthy HOA. He felt trapped, cornered, like a wolf caught in a snare. But then a lifeline appeared. A young lawyer named Sarah Jenkins, who had recently moved to the area, heard about Jed's plight. Sarah, a fiery advocate for justice, was appalled by the HOA's tactics. She saw Jed's case as a classic example of corporate bullying, of wealthy elites trying to force out a hard-working, honest man. She approached Jed, offering to represent him pro bono. Jed, initially hesitant, was won over by Sarah's passion and her unwavering belief in his innocence. Sarah immediately went on the offensive. She filed a countersuit against the HOA, accusing them of harassment, defamation, and abusive process. She exposed their tactics, their relentless campaign of complaints, their frivolous lawsuits. She painted a picture of the HOA as a group of wealthy bullies, trying to force a man off his land. The media, initially sympathetic to the HOA, began to turn against them. Sarah's passionate arguments, her unwavering defense of Jed, resonated with the public. The story of the small rancher fighting against the powerful HOA became a symbol of the struggle against corporate greed and the defense of rural values. The HOA, facing mounting public pressure and the prospect of a costly legal battle, began to back down. They offered to settle the lawsuit, agreeing to drop all charges against Jed and to pay his legal fees. Jed, however, refused to settle. He wanted his day in court. He wanted to expose the HOA's tactics, to make them pay for their harassment. The trial was a media circus. The courtroom was packed with reporters, cameras, and supporters of Jed. Sarah, in her closing argument, delivered a powerful indictment of the HOA's actions. She reminded the jury of the importance of protecting individual rights, of defending the values of rural life. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, they found the HOA guilty on all counts. They awarded Jed a substantial sum in damages, sending a clear message that bullying and harassment would not be tolerated. Jed, standing on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by his family and supporters, was a picture of quiet triumph. He had won his battle, not just for himself, but for all the small farmers and ranchers who were facing similar pressures from encroaching development. He had shown that,